The reading today is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 18. The Magi visit the Messiah. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all of the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they'd heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realised that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and in its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." Good morning, church. Is it too late to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year? I mean, as I write this, you can probably tell from the things behind me that Christmas is still on the horizon. But as you are listening, it's just behind us. So I hope you've had a good Christmas and enjoyed all of the celebrating and spending time with those you love. Talking of spending time with those you love, Adrian and I are really looking forward to being with you all in person in February. We cannot wait to catch up with you all and to hear what God is doing in Southwell. I've picked a strange passage today though, haven't I? We're used to the first bit of this chapter, the bit where the wise men go to visit Herod on their way to the manger scene. We read that bit in our nativity services. But then we usually end at verse 12. "And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route." Then we sing "We Three Kings of Orient Are" and go home and eat mince pies. But how often have you read the next bit? How often have you heard a sermon on it? It's not something that we think about often, is it? But the first thing that set me thinking about this sermon wasn't a book or a commentary or even the lectionary. It was a meme, one of those funny pictures that people send you on their phones. A friend sent me a photo of an outdoor nativity scene. Wooden stable, straw in the manger, and curled up right in the middle of it all was a very fluffy cat, fast asleep, looking entirely at home. And the caption underneath said, "Jesus is a bit fluffier than I imagined." It made me laugh And then almost immediately, it made me a little bit uncomfortable. Because the joke works, doesn't it? It works because somewhere along the way, Christmas has become fluffy, soft-edged, cosy, safe. Something we can curl up with and feel good about. A story that makes us feel warm and cosy rather than one that might disturb us. But the more I sat with that picture, the more I realised how often I do the same thing with the Christmas story itself. I smooth it, I soften it, I choose the gentler details and quietly leave the sharper ones out. Angels and shepherds? Yes, please. Lullabies and candlelight? Absolutely. But Herod, fear, escape in the middle of the night? I'm less keen on those bits. And of course, I'm saying this having just come through some of our most joyful services of the year. We just had, as I record this, we just had our all-age nativity, dressing up and laughing together. I wonder, did you see some of our pictures on Facebook? We had shepherds and angels, wise men on inflatable camels, and yes, even an inflatable dinosaur playing Herod. And I genuinely love that. I love the creativity, the welcome, the way it opens the doors wide for people who might not otherwise step inside a church. Those moments matter. They are generous, fun, joyful and evangelistic, and they're full of life and they're full of welcome and hope. But somewhere between the laughter and the costumes, a question has been nagging and niggling at me. Because the thing is, when Christmas becomes a kind of panto, Herod becomes a panto villain, a boo and hiss character, a figure of fun, someone we can safely laugh at because we know he's not real. Not really. And the danger is that we forget that this is no panto. The Herod of Matthew's Gospel is not a comic villain twirling a moustache. He's a murderous despot, deeply insecure, violently afraid, and willing to destroy innocent lives to protect his own power. This is a man who even murdered his own children when he felt they were threatening his position. This is not exaggerated for effect. This is history. This is what unchecked fear and absolute power look like. And when we soften Herod too much, when we turn him into a panto villain rather than a real person, we don't just lose the sharp edge of the story. We're in danger of losing its truth. Because Matthew's not writing a cosy fairy tale. He's telling us what it cost for love to enter the world. But I suspect that for many of us, our instinct with this passage is to simply move on. Not because we don't care and not because we don't think it's important, but because we don't want to tarnish the twinkly lights, the carols and the message of peace, hope and love that we've just been celebrating. And that's not wrong. The story of Jesus being born in Bethlehem on that very first Christmas really is good news. But the temptation is to stop there, to close the book at the stable door and quietly leave the rest unread. Because what comes next is harder. It doesn't fit neatly into a carol. And it disrupts the sense of peace we've just been celebrating. The end of Matthew 2 is the passage we often prefer to skip. And yet to skip it is to skip the very beginning of Jesus' life. Not his theology, not his teaching, but his lived experience. The moment when salvation doesn't stay still, but has to move. When the child we've just welcomed into the world becomes a child who must be carried through the night to survive. Before Jesus ever speaks a word, before he heals or teaches or gathers disciples, he flees. Along with his parents, he crosses the border as a refugee, escaping violence unleashed by a ruler desperate to cling to power. And if we ignore this part of the story, we don't just protect ourselves from discomfort. We lose something vital about who Jesus is and how God chooses to be present in our world. Matthew places Herod right at the heart of the Christmas story for a reason. He could easily have ended his telling with the visit of the Magi and the warning in a dream, a neat conclusion full of mystery and divine guidance. You know, the wise men go home by another way, danger is avoided, and the story could have faded out gently there. But Matthew refuses to stop. He slows the story down and insists that we stay with what follows. Herod is not confused, he is enraged. The birth of Jesus is not received as good news by those in power, but as a threat. Love entering the world exposes the insecurity of those who rule by fear, and Herod responds in the only way he knows, with violence. What is striking is how unremarkable the escape itself is. There are no miracles here, no angels appearing in the sky, no parting of the seas, just a dream and a hurried departure in the middle of the night and a family on the move. Jesus' life begins not with protection from danger, but with vulnerability. God puts himself entirely in human hands, dependent on obedience, courage and escape. And Matthew is careful to tell us where they flee to Egypt. And for anyone who knows Israel's history, that detail is pretty important. See, Egypt is the place of slavery and fear, the land where once an angry Pharaoh ordered the deaths of children and infants because he too felt threatened. A violent king, innocent lives lost, and a child saved who would one day lead the people into freedom. The echoes are unmistakable. But Matthew is not simply retelling an old story. He's showing us that God has stepped directly into the long, painful patterns of power and violence, not to stand above them, but to undo them from the inside. The Son of God retraces the path of his people, not as a conqueror, but as a vulnerable child. And woven through all of this is grief. Rachel weeping for her children. This isn't a footnote or a dramatic flourish that Matthew puts in there. It is the cost of a world that meets love with fear. Church, as we look at our world today, at Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, Israel, and so many more places, how many mothers today are still weeping for the loss of their children because of the actions of angry men? Matthew will not let us rush past this. This is the truth at the heart of our Christmas story. God doesn't wait for the world to become safe. He comes into it as it really is. Dangerous, unjust, and broken. And he stays. So what does this mean for us today, church? Well, if Matthew insists that we stay with the tyranny of Herod, with the hasty midnight escape to Egypt, with the vulnerability of Jesus and his family, then the question for us is not what do we think about this, but what do we do with it today? Because this story immediately brings real people into view. It brings to mind those for whom home is not a place of safety this Christmas, whether here in the UK or across the world. People fleeing war or persecution. People displaced by climate change whose homes are no longer livable. Families who have risked everything because staying put was more dangerous than leaving. It also brings closer to home those who are living on the edge in quieter ways. People relying on food banks because money simply doesn't stretch far enough. People trapped in abusive relationships for whom Christmas can be a terrifying time of the year. For people living with grief, loneliness, or anxiety, for whom this season is not the most wonderful time of the year, but something to be endured. Matthew's story won't let us turn away from them, and neither should we turn away. You see, once we allow ourselves to sit with this part of the Christmas story, it becomes impossible to keep it safely in the past. Because suddenly the Holy Family are not just figures in a nativity scene. They're a family on the run. They're doing what countless families have done ever since, weighing up unbearable risks, trying to choose the least dangerous option, leaving home because staying would mean certain death. Mary and Joseph don't go to Egypt for adventure or for opportunity. They run because they have no choice. They leave behind familiarity, security and community, carrying only what they can manage, trusting that somewhere beyond the border there will be safety, or at least survival. And when we say that Jesus was a refugee, we're not making a political point. We're making a theological one. Because you see, it means that God knows from the inside what it really means to be displaced, what it is to be vulnerable in a foreign land, what it is to depend on the kindness of strangers and the mercy of systems that may or may not be kind. And that changes, or it should change, how we see people who are forced to flee today. Not as problems to be solved or threats to be feared, but as human beings whose lives have been overturned by violence, war, persecution or terror. People whose stories echo the very beginning of Jesus' own life. The Christmas story refuses to let us pretend that God is only found in stability and safety. It insists that God is present on the margins, on the roads, in the small boats, in the temporary shelters and borrowed homes. And if we take this story seriously, we are invited to look for Christ there still. Jesus' story begins not in comfort, but in flight, in uncertainty, in danger, in places that were never meant to be permanent. And that means that when we see families today living in temporary accommodation, crossing dangerous journeys, or arriving with nothing but what they can carry, we're not looking at lives that God is distant from. We're looking at places that God knows. Because whenever we encounter someone who has been forced to flee, we're encountering a story that God recognises. So what do we do? Well, the challenge for us is to intentionally choose love over fear again and again and again. That means being generous where there is need, practical, unshowy generosity. It means offering welcome rather than suspicion, listening rather than judging, advocating rather than staying silent, speaking kindness and challenging hate speech wherever we find it. It means being people who actively create pockets of peace in a frightened world. It means intentionally carrying hope into conversations, into relationships, into ordinary moments where someone needs to know they are seen. Sometimes that will look like practical help. Sometimes it will be hospitality. Sometimes it will be prayer offered quietly and faithfully. And sometimes it will simply be the courage to act and speak with compassion when fear would be easier. And that's how our faith will grow and develop. Not in grand gestures, but in small, repeated acts of love that echo the journey of the Holy Family and keep hope moving in the world. You see, that's why it's really important that we don't stop reading Matthew chapter 2 at the end of verse 12. Keeping Herod in the Christmas story doesn't take hope away, but it gives it weight and solidity. Because it tells us that love is not naive. It's not soft and fluffy. Love's not a warm, fuzzy feeling that we get, and it doesn't depend on everything being perfect and all calm, all bright. Love is strong enough to be born into danger and to keep on loving anyway. Jesus doesn't enter our world wrapped in protection. There's no army, no palace, no guarantees. He comes as a vulnerable baby, totally dependent on others. And it's the same for us. When we follow him, we're not promised an easy life, but we are promised a love that will never leave us nor forsake us, a saviour who won't abandon us when life is hard. So the hope that we carry from this place is not that the world will suddenly become gentle, meek and mild, but that through the birth of this incredible baby, love has already entered our world and it's still on the move. And that changes how we live. It means we choose compassion over fear, kindness over suspicion, courage over indifference, not because we are especially brave, but because Christ has gone this way before us. This is not a fluffy Christmas, but it is a true one, and it's strong enough to carry us through the year ahead. God bless you, church.